Thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to introduce Elizabeth formally now. Elizabeth May has been a lifetime environmentalist and the leader of the Green Party of Canada since 2006. In 2011, she was elected as an MP to represent Saanich Gulf Islands in British Columbia, and again re-elected in 2015. In 2012, Elizabeth was the first woman to win Parliamentarian of the Year, based on votes by fellow MPs. In both 2013 and 2014, she was voted the hardest working parliamentarian. Part of Elizabeth's This is my cherry pick list, so if you want to, add anything else in. Part of Elizabeth's recent hard work was serving on the House of Commons Special Committee on Electoral Reform in 2016. And that committee was made up of 12 members representing all parties. Actually, it was a real change to what Michael described. And for months, they heard from expert witnesses, read briefs, and traveled across the country to hear from Canadians. I think the eventual fate of the work of that committee resulted in so many people feeling first dissed, as in disrespected, and then burned when Trudeau eventually threw electoral reform under the bus. So just for myself, I just attended an electoral reform town hall, met with my MP, and submitted a written brief. And I felt, wow, you just really wasted my time and a lot of other people's time. And it was interesting to me that when the work of the committee was criticized by Mariam Monsef, even the husband of one of the Liberal members of the committee briefly went rogue on Twitter and wrote, "My son saw his mum for a total of 6 hours over 3 weeks while the Special Committee on Electoral Reform toured Canada. So try again, Miriam." All this simply to say, Elizabeth, that we respect and appreciate and value the tremendous amount of work you invested in this file and in your participation on the Special Committee on Electoral Reform. Thank you. Elizabeth has always proven knowledgeable on the proportional representation file and been a staunch advocate for many years. Months of work on the Special Committee on Electoral Reform have simply deepened and broadened that knowledge, and we are about to benefit from what Elizabeth has to share. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth May.
Well, thank you to Susan. Thank you to Steve, Local Volunteers with Fair Vote, Local Volunteers with Democracy Guelph. This is a tremendous opportunity to talk about electoral reform again, and with no diminished enthusiasm. So first of all, I do want to thank Michael Chong for going first and for bringing out really critical reforms that we need within Parliament. And in case it might look to anyone as though these are, you can choose from column A or you can choose from column B, the answer is both, please. All of them as quickly as possible. Also, I pay tribute to Michael Chong. I mean, I agree with everything Michael had to say about how parties operate in Parliament, with the caveat, except the Green Party, because I have, under the Constitution of the Green Party, restricted powers as a political party leader. I am not allowed to interfere, not that I'd want to, in nomination choices made at the local level. But it is, everything Michael said exactly sets out the problem that we have that since 1867. There's been a steady increase, and sometimes not incremental, but galloping, increase in the power of well-organized, as Peter Russell makes his point in his wonderful book, Two Cheers for Minority Government. The power of well-organized, well-financed political parties has been increasing steadily, and with it the centralization of power in the office of the Prime Minister. With that has gone along with it a steady diminution in the rights and abilities of any individual MP to do anything about it. Again, I say except for the Green Party. Forgive me for acknowledging, if any other provincial party leaders are in the room, I swear I'm nonpartisan, but Mike Schreiner is here, and he's the leader of the Green Party of Ontario, so I have to say a big thank you to Mike, because we work together a lot. So here's the thing. Why do these things ride along together? Why is reform on our lips? Why does it matter to have a parliamentary democracy that makes Canadians proud of what they see taking place? And how does changing the way we elect those MPs fold in so very synergistically with improving the procedures and the democracy that goes in within Parliament? And they do go together. So I would put to you that what Canadians really want to see in their democracy is a Parliament that is a place of deliberative, respectful, serious, responsible exercise of power and responsibility to develop good law and policy for the common good. I mean, that's what we should be about. And in the very beginning, as Michael was saying, in 1867, I love the quote from Sir John A. Macdonald when he referred to his caucus as loose fish. He did not know where they were going to go on any given day. He didn't know how they were going to vote. And Michael's absolutely right in saying these days, not even voting against your government, but speaking out against government policy can get you punished. The most recent example happened just as we headed into the Thanksgiving weekend, where New Brunswick Liberal Wayne Long was removed from not one but two parliamentary committees for criticizing pending changes to the tax structure as proposed by Bill Morneau. Now, committee work is important, but I believe so too is the question of being responsible, having responsible government. That means actually in the system we're supposed to have in Westminster parliamentary democracy is that every single MP, if you're not sitting in cabinet, so you're what's now called a backbencher Liberal in today's Ottawa, your job is to represent your constituents every single day and go in and ask the government hard questions. Push for what's going on for your own community, not taking party talking points and asking softball questions when it gets to be your turn to say something. This has all been well laid out, by the way, in another book I thoroughly recommend by Brent Rathgaber, talking about responsible government. He himself, a former Conservative in the Harper era, who left caucus and was relegated to independent status for criticizing his government. This is something, by the way, I want to add a little bit of an add-on to the point that Michael made about the role of people like me, members of Parliament, who are part of an elected party. I mean, if you check the House of Commons website, you will see that I'm not an independent. I am there as a member of Parliament representing Saanich Gulf Islands under the banner of the Green Party of Canada. It's in the maps of the parliamentary seating plan. I am literally and honestly there as a Green Party MP. I'm not there as an independent. But strangely enough, only in Canadian Westminster parliamentary democracy has this idea of having to have a minimum number of seats caught on. So this recognized party status means I can't sit on committees unless there's something special about them, and I was on the Special Parliamentary Committee on Electoral Reform, as Susan was telling you. So how do these two things go together? Because I have a lot of ideas for reforming the way Parliament works. But at its essence, Westminster parliamentary democracy doesn't have the built-in set of checks and balances that Michael was describing. We've seen less of them as the political party back room controls more and more of what the MPs do. But even in the time of Sir John A. Macdonald, you couldn't describe a government where the governing party had the majority of seats as having anything like the checks and balances that were created in the US Constitution. Not that I would want us to emulate that, but the contexts were very different. You know, in the 1780s, when the US constitutional drafters were getting to work and sharpening their feather quills, it was in the context of people who had just overthrown the monarchy in a violent revolution. This was a bunch of people who had no innate sense of deference to authority. They were not prepared to trust anyone with abuse of power, and so they crafted a constitution where, and we can now say as we look to the south, thank God, but they crafted a constitution where the president has very little power. The executive branch has some, but the legislative branch has a great deal, and so does the judiciary. Now, in Canada, if a prime minister has a majority of the seats in the House under their party banner, that prime minister controls automatically the executive and the legislative. And that's the key reason that I believe Canada so desperately needs to have a voting system that does not allow a big gulf, or even a small gulf, but certainly a big gulf to develop between the popular vote and the seat count. The more that the popular vote, which is what you think in a democracy is going to get you your government, it's kind of intuitive. How did people vote? Well, that should be the government they get. But under the system of voting that we have, first past the post, and there are others where this can happen, such as in ranked ballots, there's a divergence. The seat count, how many seats did a party win, since it goes one at a time, riding by riding, can quickly diverge from the popular vote. When you're electing a prime minister, well, you don't elect a prime minister, we elect individual members of parliament. When you're electing a government, who's going to hold the confidence of the House? Which of the parties that are out there on the hustings is going to end up with enough seats to hold the confidence of the House, since we don't directly elect prime ministers in Canada? That question really matters, that you have a majority of public support for any party or leader that gains the majority of the seats and thus the automatic confidence of the House. Because that leader has far greater power centralized in his or her hands than one south of the border. Because a majority parliament automatically means the prime minister controls the legislative and the executive. The only check on power is that within the courts. So if we're going to have a system of government of Westminster parliamentary democracy, which I personally love, we can do some things to make sure there isn't abuse of power. We now have to build these things into the system. I put together a whole set of reforms that I put forward to the Parliamentary Committee on House and the PROC Committee on Procedure and House Affairs in the spring, when the Government House Leader, Bardish Chager, suggested amendments to our rules of how we operate. And I went to work and wrote a 30-page alternate proposal that included such things as no prorogations should be allowed unless there has been a vote of the House to assure that the Prime Minister who asked for prorogation holds the confidence of the House at that moment. Now, these are recommendations. These are recommendations that came through from political scientists who actually testified to our procedure, our special committee on electoral reform, because the experts we consulted on electoral reform didn't constrain themselves to electoral reform only. People like Peter Russell or Professor Hugo Cyr from Laval put forward a lot of very important amendments to change our House procedures so that they would be more democratic. But let's get to electoral reform. For me, the key reason, again, and I agree with Michael, we're in an era where almost anything weird and fluky can happen. And you don't want to run the risk that some outlier party or leader with views that would never be held by the majority of Canadians can hold a majority government with less than the support of the majority of Canadians. Our system of government leaves us our voting system leaves us very vulnerable to this. So replacing first past the post isn't that difficult. It doesn't require opening the Constitution, finding a system of voting, and I thought Justin Trudeau meant it when he said 2015 would be the last election in Canada held under first past the post. I really believed he meant it when word for word that commitment, starting with in order to ensure that every vote counts, 2015 would be the last election held under first past the post, appeared in the speech from the throne in December of 2015. I was shocked, and to my core, I mean, I felt a physical shock akin to being kicked in the gut by a mule, when reporters told me Justin Trudeau has rewritten Karina Gould's mandate letter. It's no longer in her mandate. I said, you've got to be wrong. That can't be true. I mean, I'm not cynical enough, I guess. I just thought that literally can't be true. You must have it wrong. So where do we go from here? And I know this crowd is very well informed on mixed member proportional versus single transferable vote. Let me just cut to the chase and say that the majority of the MPs on our electoral reform committee were very clear on a couple things. One, it would be inappropriate in Canada to have a system for proportional representation that did not include the connection between an MP who's local, who knows the community, and somebody that you can say to yourself, I know who my go-to person is. I know who my personal MP is. I'm going to that person. Now, that still leaves us with a cluster of possibilities that are proportional in the sense that, again, you don't want a big divergence between the popular vote and the seat count. So you can take any mixture of mixed member proportional, such as that is used in Germany, or as good guidance to Canadians, the only Westminster parliamentary democracy to get rid of first past the post was New Zealand, and they moved mixed member proportional. Small caveat to that, Ireland, the Irish Parliament was given single transferable vote in 1920. By whom? Oh, by the Parliament at Westminster, of course, because the thing is, they wanted Ireland to have the chance to vote. They wanted the Irish to elect their own parliament, but they were very worried about minority rights. So first past the post simply wouldn't do for Ireland. Fine to keep it for the Parliament of Westminster, but in 1920, Westminster gave Ireland single transferable vote to protect minority Protestant rights. So single transferable vote represents something that we have a lot of experience with. Mixed member proportional, we have experience from Germany, New Zealand. Single transferable vote, we also see it play in the Australian Senate. Australia, by the way, is a great petri dish for democracy, because as we sometimes heard from people appearing before our committee, or people desperate to say that proportional representation didn't automatically elect more women and minorities than first past the post, it was also cultural differences and other factors at play. Australia is a great example to study because although they don't use first past the post in the Australian lower house, they use the variant of it called preferential ballot. So it's one riding at a time and by rank ballot. Excuse me, the Australian Senate is elected by single transferable vote. So it's quite striking to see the much higher proportion of women elected in the Australian Senate by the same electorate that elects fewer women by preferential ballot. It does, voting systems do have an impact on the results that you get. So back to why it's so critical. Well, thank you, Susan. Reforming Parliament to ensure that it's a respectful place of deliberation can be accomplished by reducing the power of the back rooms of political parties, by getting rid of the whip telling the speaker what opposition MPs are going to ask questions and in what order. That would be a good thing. And as I write about it in my chapter of the book, so I won't go through the whole example now, but the story is fabulous. Jean Sauvé, when she was speaker, claimed she couldn't spot everybody at a distance. And she asked the whip as a favor for the whips to give her the lists of who was going to speak. There's no rule. We just slavishly follow Jean Sauvé's bad eyesight or poor memory. We're not sure which. In any case, we need to reform rules within Parliament. I completely agree with everything Michael has said. But we also need to, as if we were in an episode of Back to the Future with a time travel car that actually worked, we need to get out ahead of ourselves and protect any future voters from electing a Canadian version of, I don't know, let's make it up, it couldn't happen in real life, a narcissistic reality TV show host with absolutely no capacity for governance suddenly becomes the leader of a major nation. To protect ourselves from that, we need to ensure that you need a majority of the votes of Canadians who turn out to vote before you can occupy the chair at the head of the cabinet table. Primus inter pares, first among equals, our Prime Minister. So thank you very much, and we'll move to the next phase.